Chapter 5 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 5. "Ah, yes, I attended the inquiry," he would say, "and to this day I haven't left off wondering why I went. I'm willing to believe each of us has a guardian angel, if you fellows will concede to me that each of us has a familiar devil as well. I want you to own up, because I don't like to feel exceptional in any way, and I know I have him. The devil, I mean. I haven't seen him, of course, but I go upon circumstantial evidence. He's there right enough, and, being malicious, he lets me in for that kind of thing. What kind of thing, you ask? Why, the inquiry thing, the yellow dog thing. You wouldn't think a mangy native tyke would be allowed to trip up people in the veranda of a magistrate's court, would you? The kind of thing that by devious, unexpected, truly diabolical ways causes me to run up against men with soft spots, with hard spots, with hidden plague spots, by Jove, and loosens their tongues at the sight of me for their infernal confidences, as though, forsooth, I had no confidences to make to myself, as though, God help me, I didn't have enough confidential information about myself to harrow my own soul till the end of my appointed time. And what have I done to be thus favoured, I want to know? I declare I am as full of my own concerns as the next man, and I have as much memory as the average pilgrim in this valley, so you see I am not particularly fit to be a receptacle of confessions. Then why? Can't tell, unless it be to make time pass away after dinner. Charlie, my dear chap, your dinner was extremely good, and in consequence these men here look upon a quiet rubber as a tumultuous occupation. They wallow in your good chairs and think to themselves, hang exertion, let that Marlowe talk. Talk? So be it. It's easy enough to talk of Master Jim after a good spread, 200 feet above the sea level, with a box of decent cigars handy, on a blessed evening of freshness and starlight that would make the best of us forget we are only on sufferance here and got to pick our way in cross-lights, watching every precious minute and every irremediable step, trusting we shall manage yet to go out decently in the end, but not so sure of it after all, and with dashed little help to expect from those we touch elbows with right and left. Of course there are men here and there to whom the whole of life is like an after-dinner hour with a cigar, easy, pleasant, empty, perhaps enlivened by some fable of strife to be forgotten before the end is told, even if there happens to be any end to it. My eyes met his for the first time at that inquiry. You must know that everybody connected in any way with the sea was there, because the affair had been notorious for days, ever since that mysterious cable message came from Aden to start us all cackling. I say mysterious because it was so in a sense, though it contained a naked fact, about as naked and ugly as a fact can well be. The whole waterside talked of nothing else. First thing in the morning, as I was dressing in my stateroom, I would hear through the bulkhead my Parsee Dubash jabbering about the Patna with the steward while he drank a cup of tea, by favour, in the pantry. No sooner on shore I would meet some acquaintance, and the first remark would be, "Did you ever hear of anything to beat this?" And according to his kind, the man would smile cynically, or look sad, or let out a swear or two. Complete strangers would accost each other familiarly, just for the sake of easing their minds on the subject. Every confounded loafer in the town came in for a harvest of drinks over this affair. You heard of it in the harbour office, at every ship's broker's, at your agents', from whites, from natives, from half-castes, from the very boatmen squatting half-naked on the stone steps as you went up, by Jove. There was some indignation, not a few jokes, and no end of discussions as to what had become of them, you know. This went on for a couple of weeks or more, and the opinion that whatever was mysterious in this affair would turn out to be tragic as well began to prevail, when one fine morning, as I was standing in the shade by the steps of the harbour office, I perceived 4 men walking towards me along the quay. I wondered for a while where that queer lot had sprung from, and suddenly, I may say, I shouted to myself, "Here they are!" There they were, sure enough, 3 of them, as large as life, and one much larger of girth than any living man has a right to be, just landed with a good breakfast inside of them from an outward-bound Dale Line steamer that had come in about an hour after sunrise. There could be no mistake. I spotted the jolly skipper of the Patna at the first glance, the fattest man in the whole blessed tropical belt clear round that good old earth of ours. Moreover, 9 months or so before, I had come across him in the Samarang. His steamer was loading in the roads, and he was abusing the tyrannical institutions of the German Empire, and soaking himself in beer all day long, and day after day in De Jong's back shop, till De Jong, who charged £1 for every bottle without as much as the quiver of an eyelid, would beckon me aside, and with his little leathery face all puckered up, declare confidentially, "Business is business, but this man, Captain, he make me very sick. Pfui." I was looking at him from the shade. He was hurrying on a little in advance, and the sunlight beating on him brought out his bulk in a startling way. He made me think of a trained baby elephant walking on hind legs. He was extravagantly gorgeous too, got up in a soiled sleeping suit, bright green and deep orange vertical stripes, with a pair of ragged straw slippers on his bare feet, and somebody's cast-off pith hat, very dirty and 2 sizes too small for him, tied up with a manila rope yarn on the top of his big head. You understand, a man like that hasn't a ghost of a chance when it comes to borrowing clothes. Very well. On he came in hot haste, without a look right or left, passed within 3 feet of me, and in the innocence of his heart went on pelting upstairs into the harbour office to make his deposition or report, or whatever you like to call it. It appears he addressed himself in the first instance to the principal shipping master. Archie Ruthvel had just come in, and, as his story goes, was about to begin his arduous day by giving a dressing down to his chief clerk. Some of you might have known him, an obliging little Portuguese half-caste with a miserably skinny neck, and always on the hop to get something from the shipmasters in the way of edibles, a piece of salt pork, a bag of biscuits, a few potatoes, or what not. One voyage, I recollect, I tipped him a live sheep out of the remnant of my sea stock. Not that I wanted him to do anything for me. He couldn't, you know, but because his childlike belief in the sacred right to perquisites quite touched my heart. It was so strong as to be almost beautiful. The race, the 2 races rather, and the climate. However, never mind. I know where I have a friend for life. Well, Ruthvel says he was giving him a severe lecture on official morality, I suppose, when he heard a kind of subdued commotion at his back, and turning his head he saw, in his own words, something round and enormous, resembling a 1600-weight sugar hogshead wrapped in striped flannelette, upended in the middle of the large floor space in the office. He declares he was so taken aback that for quite an appreciable time he did not realize the thing was alive, and sat still, wondering for what purpose and by what means that object had been transported in front of his desk. The archway from the ante-room was crowded with punkah pullers, sweepers, police peons, the coxswain and crew of the harbour steam launch, all craning their necks and almost climbing on each other's backs. Quite a riot. By that time the fellow had managed to tug and jerk his hat clear of his head, and advanced with slight bows at Ruthvel, who told me the sight was so discomposing that for some time he listened, quite unable to make out what that apparition wanted. It spoke in a harsh voice, and lugubrious but intrepid, and little by little it dawned upon Archie that this was a development of the Patna case. He says that as soon as he understood who it was before him, he felt quite unwell. Archie is so sympathetic and easily upset, but pulled himself together and shouted, "Stop! I can't listen to you. You must go to the master attendant. I can't possibly listen to you. Captain Elliot is the man you want to see. This way, this way." He jumped up, ran round that long counter, pulled, shoved. The other let him, surprised but obedient at first, and only at the door of the private office some sort of animal instinct made him hang back and snort like a frightened bullock. "Look here, what's up? Let go. Look here." Archie flung open the door without knocking. "The master of the Patna, sir," he shouts. "Go in, Captain." He saw the old man lift his head from some writing so sharp that his nose nippers fell off, banged the door to, and fled to his desk, where he had some papers waiting for his signature. But he says the row that burst out in there was so awful that he couldn't collect his senses sufficiently to remember the spelling of his own name. Archie's the most sensitive shipping master in the 2 hemispheres. He declares he felt as though he had thrown a man to a hungry lion. No doubt the noise was great. I heard it down below, and I have every reason to believe it was heard clear across the esplanade as far as the bandstand. Old Father Elliot had a great stock of words, and could shout, and didn't mind who he shouted at either. He would have shouted at the Viceroy himself, as he used to tell me. I'm as high as I can get. My pension is safe. I have a few pounds laid by, and if they don't like my notions of duty, I would just as soon go home as not. I am an old man, and I have always spoken my mind. All I care for now is to see my girls married before I die. He was a little crazy on that point. His 3 daughters were awfully nice, though they resembled him amazingly, and on the mornings he woke up with a gloomy view of their matrimonial prospects, the office would read it in his eye and tremble, because they said he was sure to have somebody for breakfast. However, that morning he did not eat the renegade, but, if I may be allowed to carry on the metaphor, chewed him up very small, so to speak, and ejected him again. Thus, in a very few moments, I saw his monstrous bulk descend in haste and stand still on the outer steps. He had stopped close to me for the purpose of profound meditation. His large purple cheeks quivered. He was biting his thumb, and after a while noticed me with a sidelong, vexed look. The other 3 chaps that had landed with him made a little group, waiting at some distance. There was a sallow-faced, mean little chap with his arm in a sling, and a long individual in a blue flannel coat as dry as a chip and no stouter than a broomstick, with drooping grey moustaches, who looked about him with an air of jaunty imbecility. The third was an upstanding, broad-shouldered youth, with his hands in his pockets, turning his back on the other 2, who appeared to be talking together earnestly. He stared across the empty esplanade. A ramshackle gharry, all dust and Venetian blinds, pulled up short opposite the group, and the driver, throwing up his right foot over his knee, gave himself up to the critical examination of his toes. The young chap, making no movement, not even stirring his head, just stared into the sunshine. This was my first view of Jim. He looked as unconcerned and unapproachable as only the young can look. There he stood, clean-limbed, clean-faced, firm on his feet, as promising a boy as the sun ever shone on, and looking at him, knowing all he knew and a little more too, I was as angry as though I had detected him trying to get something out of me by false pretences. He had no business to look so sound. I thought to myself, well, if this sort can go wrong like that, and I felt as though I could fling down my hat and dance on it from sheer mortification, as I once saw the skipper of an Italian barque do because his duffer of a mate got into a mess with his anchors when making a flying moor in a roadstead full of ships. I asked myself, seeing him there apparently so much at ease, is he silly? Is he callous? He seemed ready to start whistling a tune. And note, I did not care a rap about the behaviour of the other 2. Their person somehow fitted the tale that was public property, and was going to be the subject of an official inquiry. "That old mad rogue upstairs called me a hound," said the captain of the Patna. I can't tell whether he recognised me. I rather think he did, but at any rate our glances met. He glared. I smiled. Hound was the very mildest epithet that had reached me through the open window. "Steady," I said, from some strange inability to hold my tongue. He nodded, bit his thumb again, swore under his breath, then, lifting his head and looking at me with sullen and passionate impudence, "Bah! The Pacific is big, my friend. You damned Englishmen can do your worst. I know where there's plenty room for a man like me. I am well acquainted in Apia, in Honolulu, in—" He paused reflectively, while without effort I could depict to myself the sort of people he was acquaint with in those places. I won't make a secret of it that I had been acquaint with not a few of that sort myself. There are times when a man must act as though life were equally sweet in any company. I've known such a time, and what's more, I shan't now pretend to pull a long face over my necessity, because a good many of that bad company, from want of moral, what shall I say, posture, or from some other equally profound cause, were twice as instructive and 20 times more amusing than the usual respectable thief of commerce you fellows ask to sit at your table without any real necessity, from habit, from cowardice, from good nature, from 100 sneaking and inadequate reasons. "You Englishmen are all rogues," went on my patriotic Flensburg or Stettin Australian. I really don't recollect now what decent little port on the shores of the Baltic was defiled by being the nest of that precious bird. "What are you to shout, eh? You tell me. You know better than other people, and that old rogue, he make a goddamn fuss with me." His thick carcass trembled on its legs that were like a pair of pillars. It trembled from head to foot. "That's what you English always make a damn fuss for any little thing, because I was not born in your damn country. Take away my certificate. Take it. I don't want that certificate. A man like me don't want your werflich certificate. I spit on it." He spat. "I will an American citizen become," he cried, fretting and fuming and shuffling his feet as if to free his ankles from some invisible and mysterious grasp that would not let him get away from that spot. He made himself so warm that the top of his bullet head positively smoked. Nothing mysterious prevented me from going away. Curiosity is the most obvious of sentiments, and it held me there to see the effect of a full information upon that young fellow who, hands in pockets and turning his back upon the sidewalk, gazed across the grass plots of the esplanade at the yellow portico of the Malabar Hotel with the air of a man about to go for a walk as soon as his friend is ready. That's how he looked, and it was odious. I waited to see him, overwhelmed, confounded, pierced through and through, squirming like an impaled beetle, and I was half afraid to see it too, if you understand what I mean. Nothing more awful than to watch a man who has been found out, not in a crime, but in a more than criminal weakness. The commonest sort of fortitude prevents us from becoming criminals in a legal sense. It is from weakness unknown, but perhaps suspected, as in some parts of the world you suspect a deadly snake in every bush, from weakness that may lie hidden, watched or unwatched, prayed against or manfully scorned, repressed or may be ignored more than half a lifetime. Not one of us is safe. We are snared into doing things for which we get called names and things for which we get hanged, and yet the spirit may well survive the condemnation, survive the halter, by Jove. And there are things, they look small enough sometimes too, by which some of us are totally and completely undone. I watched the youngster there. I liked his appearance. I knew his appearance. He came from the right place. He was one of us. He stood there for all the parentage of his kind, for men and women by no means clever or amusing, but whose very existence is based upon honest faith and upon the instinct of courage. I don't mean military courage or civil courage or any special kind of courage. I mean just that inborn ability to look temptation straight in the face, a readiness unintellectual enough, goodness knows, but without pose, a power of resistance, don't you see, ungracious if you like, but priceless, an unthinking and blessed stiffness before the outward and inward terrors, before the might of nature and the seductive corruption of men, backed by a faith invulnerable to the strength of facts, to the contagion of example, to the solicitation of ideas. Hang ideas! They are tramps, vagabonds, knocking at the back door of your mind, each taking a little of your substance, each carrying away some crumb of that belief in a few simple notions you must cling to if you want to live decently and would like to die easy. This has nothing to do with Jim directly, only he was outwardly so typical of that good, stupid kind we like to feel marching right and left of us in life, of the kind that is not disturbed by the vagaries of intelligence and the perversions of nerves, let us say. He was the kind of fellow you would, on the strength of his looks, leave in charge of the deck, figuratively and professionally speaking. I say I would, and I ought to know. Haven't I turned out youngsters enough in my time for the service of the red rag to the craft of the sea, to the craft whose sole secret could be expressed in one short sentence, and yet must be driven afresh every day into young heads till it becomes the component part of every waking thought, till it is present in every dream of their young sleep. The sea has been good to me, but when I remember all these boys that passed through my hands, some grown up now and some drowned by this time, but all good stuff for the sea, I don't think I've done badly by it either. Were I to go home tomorrow, I bet that before 2 days passed over my head, some sunburnt young chief mate would overtake me at some dock gateway or other, and a fresh deep voice speaking above my hat would ask, "Don't you remember me, sir? Why, little so-and-so, such and such a ship, it was my first voyage." And I would remember a bewildered little shaver no higher than the back of this chair, with a mother and perhaps a big sister on the quay, very quiet but too upset to wave their handkerchief at the ship that glides out gently between the pier heads. Or perhaps some decent middle-aged father who had come early with his boy to see him off, and stays all the morning because he is interested in the windlass, apparently, and stays too long and has got to scramble ashore at last with no time at all to say good-bye. The mud pilot on the poop sings out to me in a drawl, "Hold her with the check line for a moment, Mr. Mate. There's a gentleman wants to get ashore." "Up with you, sir." "Nearly got carried off to Talcahuano, didn't you? Now's your time. Easy does it. All right. Slack away again forward there." The tugs, smoking like the pit of perdition, get hold and churn the old river into fury. The gentleman ashore is dusting his knees. The benevolent steward has shied his umbrella after him. All very proper. He has offered his bit of sacrifice to the sea, and now he may go home pretending he thinks nothing of it, and the little willing victim shall be very seasick before next morning. By and by, when he has learned all the little mysteries and the one great secret of the craft, he shall be fit to live or die as the sea may decree, and the man who had taken a hand in this fool game, in which the sea wins every toss, will be pleased to have his back slapped by a heavy young hand, and to hear a cheery sea-puppy voice, "Do you remember me, sir? The little so-and-so." I tell you this is good. It tells you that once in your life at least you had gone the right way to work. I have been thus slapped, and I have winced, for the slap was heavy, and I have glowed all day long and gone to bed feeling less lonely in the world by virtue of that hearty thump. Don't I remember the little so-and-sos? I tell you I ought to know the right kind of looks. I would have trusted the deck to that youngster on the strength of a single glance, and gone to sleep with both eyes, and by Jove it wouldn't have been safe. There are depths of horror in that thought. He looked as genuine as a new sovereign, but there was some infernal alloy in his metal. How much? The least thing, the least drop of something rare and accursed, the least drop. But he made you, standing there with his don't-care-hang air, he made you wonder whether perchance he were nothing more rare than brass. I couldn't believe it. I tell you, I wanted to see him squirm for the honour of the craft. The other two no-account chaps spotted their captain and began to move slowly towards us. They chatted together as they strolled, and I did not care any more than if they had not been visible to the naked eye. They grinned at each other, might have been exchanging jokes for all I know. I saw that with one of them it was a case of a broken arm, and as to the long individual with grey moustaches, he was the chief engineer, and in various ways a pretty notorious personality. They were nobodies. They approached. The skipper gazed in an inanimate way between his feet. He seemed to be swollen to an unnatural size by some awful disease, by the mysterious action of an unknown poison. He lifted his head, saw the two before him waiting, opened his mouth with an extraordinary sneering contortion of his puffed face, to speak to them, I suppose, and then a thought seemed to strike him. His thick, purplish lips came together without a sound. He went off in a resolute waddle to the gharry and began to jerk at the door-handle with such a blind brutality of impatience that I expected to see the whole concern overturned on its side, pony and all. The driver, shaken out of his meditation over the sole of his foot, displayed at once all the signs of intense terror, and held with both hands, looking round from his box at this vast carcass forcing its way into his conveyance. The little machine shook and rocked tumultuously, and the crimson nape of that lowered neck, the size of those straining thighs, the immense heaving of that dingy, striped green and orange back, the whole burrowing effort of that gaudy and sordid mass, troubled one's sense of probability with a droll and fearsome effect, like one of those grotesque and distinct visions that scare and fascinate one in a fever. He disappeared. I half expected the roof to split in two, the little box on wheels to burst open in the manner of a ripe cotton pod, but it only sank with a click of flattened springs, and suddenly one Venetian blind rattled down. His shoulders reappeared, jammed in the small opening. His head hung out, distended and tossing like a captive balloon, perspiring, furious, spluttering. He reached for the gharry wallow with vicious flourishes of a fist as dumpy and red as a lump of raw meat. He roared at him to be off, to go on. Where? Into the Pacific, perhaps. The driver lashed, the pony snorted, reared once, and darted off at a gallop. Where? To Apia? To Honolulu? He had 6,000 miles of tropical belt to disport himself in, and I did not hear the precise address. A snorting pony snatched him into Ewigkeit in the twinkling of an eye, and I never saw him again. And what's more, I don't know of anybody that ever had a glimpse of him after he departed from my knowledge, sitting inside a ramshackle little gharry that fled round the corner in a white smother of dust. He departed, disappeared, vanished, absconded, and absurdly enough it looked as though he had taken that gharry with him, for never again did I come across a sorrel pony with a slit ear and a lackadaisical Tamil driver afflicted by a sore foot. The Pacific is indeed big, but whether he found a place for a display of his talents in it or not, the fact remains he had flown into space like a witch on a broomstick. The little chap with his arm in a sling started to run after the carriage, bleating, "Captain! I say, Captain! I say!" But after a few steps stopped short, hung his head, and walked back slowly. At the sharp rattle of the wheels the young fellow spun round where he stood. He made no other movement, no gesture, no sign, and remained facing in the new direction after the gharry had swung out of sight. All this happened in much less time than it takes to tell, since I'm trying to interpret for you into slow speech the instantaneous effect of visual impressions. Next moment the half-caste clerk, sent by Archie to look a little after the poor castaways of the Patna, came upon the scene. He ran out eager and bareheaded, looking right and left, and very full of his mission. It was doomed to be a failure as far as the principal reason was concerned, but he approached the others with fussy importance, and almost immediately found himself involved in a violent altercation with the chap that carried his arm in a sling, and who turned out to be extremely anxious for a row. He wasn't going to be ordered about, not he, b'gosh. He wouldn't be terrified with a pack of lies by a cocky half-bred little quill driver. He was not going to be bullied by no object of that sort, if the story were true, ever so. He bawled his wish, his desire, his determination to go to bed. "If you weren't a God-forsaken Portuguese," I heard him yell, "you would know that the hospital is the right place for me." He pushed the fist of his sound arm under the other's nose. A crowd began to collect. The half-caste, flustered, but doing his best to appear dignified, tried to explain his intentions. I went away without waiting to see the end. But it so happened that I had a man in the hospital at the time, and going there to see about him the day before the opening of the inquiry, I saw in the white men's ward that little chap tossing on his back with his arm in splints and quite light-headed. To my great surprise, the other one, the long individual with drooping white moustache, had also found his way there. I remembered I had seen him slinking away during the quarrel, in a half-prance, half-shuffle, and trying very hard not to look scared. He was no stranger to the port, it seems, and in his distress was able to make tracks straight to Mariana's billiard-room and grog-shop near the bazaar. That unspeakable vagabond, Mariani, who had known the man and had ministered to his vices in one or two other places, kissed the ground, in a manner of speaking, before him, and shut him up with a supply of bottles in an upstairs room of his infamous hovel. It appears he was under some hazy apprehension as to his personal safety, and wished to be concealed. However, Mariani told me a long time after, when he came on board one day to dun my steward for the price of some cigars, that he would have done more for him without asking any questions, from gratitude for some unholy favour received very many years ago, as far as I could make out. He thumped twice his brawny chest, rolled enormous black and white eyes glistening with tears. "Antonio never forget! Antonio never forget!" What was the precise nature of the immoral obligation I never learned, but be it what it may, he had every facility given him to remain under lock and key, with a chair, a table, a mattress in a corner, and a litter of fallen plaster on the floor, in an irrational state of funk, and keeping up his pecker with such tonics as Mariani dispensed. This lasted till the evening of the third day, when, after letting out a few horrible screams, he found himself compelled to seek safety in flight from a legion of centipedes. He burst the door open, made one leap for dear life down the crazy little stairway, landed bodily on Mariani's stomach, picked himself up, and bolted like a rabbit into the streets. The police plucked him off a garbage heap in the early morning. At first he had a notion they were carrying him off to be hanged, and fought for liberty like a hero, but when I sat down by his bed he had been very quiet for 2 days. His lean bronzed head with white moustaches looked fine and calm on the pillow, like the head of a war-worn soldier with a childlike soul, had it not been for a hint of spectral alarm that lurked in the blank glitter of his glance, resembling a nondescript form of a terror crouching silently behind a pane of glass. He was so extremely calm that I began to indulge in the eccentric hope of hearing something explanatory of the famous affair from his point of view. Why I longed to go grubbing into the deplorable details of an occurrence which, after all, concerned me no more than as a member of an obscure body of men held together by a community of inglorious toil and by fidelity to a certain standard of conduct, I can't explain. You may call it an unhealthy curiosity if you like, but I have a distinct notion I wished to find something. Perhaps unconsciously I hoped I would find that something, some profound and redeeming cause, some merciful explanation, some convincing shadow of an excuse. I can see well enough now that I hoped for the impossible, for the laying of what is the most obstinate ghost of man's creation, of the uneasy doubt uprising like a mist, secret and gnawing like a worm, and more chilling than the certitude of death, the doubt of the sovereign power enthroned in a fixed standard of conduct. It is the hardest thing to stumble against. It is the thing that breeds yelling panics and good little quiet villainies. It's the true shadow of calamity. Did I believe in a miracle? And why did I desire it so ardently? Was it for my own sake that I wished to find some shadow of an excuse for that young fellow whom I had never seen before, but whose appearance alone added a touch of personal concern to the thoughts suggested by the knowledge of his weakness, made it a thing of mystery and terror, like a hint of a destructive fate ready for us all whose youth in its day had resembled his youth? I fear that such was the secret motive of my prying. I was, and no mistake, looking for a miracle. The only thing that at this distance of time strikes me as miraculous is the extent of my imbecility. I positively hoped to obtain from that battered and shady invalid some exorcism against the ghost of doubt. I must have been pretty desperate, too, for without loss of time, after a few indifferent and friendly sentences which he answered with languid readiness, just as any decent sick man would do, I produced the word Patna, wrapped up in a delicate question as in a wisp of floss silk. I was delicate selfishly. I did not want to startle him. I had no solicitude for him. I was not furious with him and sorry for him. His experience was of no importance. His redemption would have had no point for me. He had grown old in minor iniquities, and could no longer inspire aversion or pity. He repeated Patna interrogatively, seemed to make a short effort of memory, and said, "Quite right. I'm an old stager out here. I saw her go down." I made ready to vent my indignation at such a stupid lie when he added smoothly, "She was full of reptiles." This made me pause. What did he mean? The unsteady phantom of terror behind his glassy eyes seemed to stand still and look into mine wistfully. "They turned me out of my bunk in the middle watch to look at her sinking," he pursued in a reflective tone. His voice sounded alarmingly strong all at once. I was sorry for my folly. There was no snowy-winged coif of a nursing sister to be seen flitting in the perspective of the ward, but away in the middle of a long row of empty iron bedsteads, an accident case from some ship in the road, sat up, brown and gaunt, with a white bandage set rakishly on the forehead. Suddenly my interesting invalid shot out an arm thin like a tentacle and clawed my shoulder. Only my eyes were good enough to see. I am famous for my eyesight. That's why they called me, I expect. None of them was quick enough to see her go, but they saw that she was gone right enough, and sang out together like this. A wolfish howl searched the very recesses of my soul. "Ah, make him dry up," whined the accident case irritably. "You don't believe me, I suppose," went on the other, with an air of ineffable conceit. "I tell you there are no such eyes as mine this side of the Persian Gulf. Look under the bed." Of course I stooped instantly. I defy anybody not to have done so. "What can you see?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, feeling awfully ashamed of myself. He scrutinized my face with wild and withering contempt. "Just so," he said. "But if I were to look, I could see. There's no eyes like mine, I tell you." Again he clawed, pulling at me downwards in his eagerness to relieve himself by a confidential communication. "Millions of pink toads. There's no eyes like mine. Millions of pink toads. It's worse than seeing a ship sink. I could look at sinking ships and smoke my pipe all day long. Why don't they give me back my pipe? I would get a smoke while I watched these toads. The ship was full of them. They've got to be watched, you know." He winked facetiously. The perspiration dripped on him off my head. My drill coat clung to my wet back. The afternoon breeze swept impetuously over the row of bedsteads. The stiff folds of curtains stirred perpendicularly, rattling on brass rods. The covers of empty beds blew about noiselessly near the bare floor all along the line, and I shivered to the very marrow. The soft wind of the tropics played in that naked ward as bleak as a winter's gale in an old barn at home. "Don't you let him start his hollering, mister," hailed from afar the accident case, in a distressed, angry shout that came ringing between the walls like a quavering call down a tunnel. The clawing hand hauled at my shoulder. He leered at me knowingly. "The ship was full of them, you know, and we had to clear out on the strict QT," he whispered with extreme rapidity. All pink, as big as mastiffs, with an eye on the top of the head and claws all round their ugly mouths. Oh, oh!" Quick jerks, as of galvanic shocks, disclosed under the flat coverlet the outlines of meagre and agitated legs. He let go my shoulder and reached after something in the air. His body trembled tensely like a released harp-string, and while I looked down, the spectral horror in him broke through his glassy gaze. Instantly his face of an old soldier, with its noble and calm outlines, became decomposed before my eyes by the corruption of stealthy cunning, of an abominable caution, and of desperate fear. He restrained a cry. "Shh! What are they doing now, down there?" he asked, pointing to the floor with fantastic precautions of voice and gestures, whose meaning, borne upon my mind in a lurid flash, made me very sick of my cleverness. "They're all asleep," I answered, watching him narrowly. That was it. That's what he wanted to hear. These were the exact words that could calm him. He drew a long breath. "Shh! Quiet! Steady! I am an old stager out here. I know them brutes. Bash in the head of the first that stirs. There's too many of 'em, and she won't swim more than 10 minutes. He panted again. "Hurry up," he yelled suddenly, and went on in a steady scream. "They are all awake, millions of them. They are trampling on me. Wait, oh wait, I'll smash them in heaps like flies. Wait for me. Help! Help!" An interminable and sustained howl completed my discomfiture. I saw in the distance the accident case raise deplorably both his hands to his bandaged head. A dresser, aproned to the chin, showed himself in the vista of the ward as if seen in the small end of a telescope. I confessed myself fairly routed, and without more ado, stepping out through one of the long windows, escaped into the outside gallery. The howl pursued me like a vengeance. I turned into a deserted landing, and suddenly all became very still and quiet around me, and I descended the bare and shiny staircase in a silence that enabled me to compose my distracted thoughts. Down below I met one of the resident surgeons who was crossing the courtyard and stopped me. "Been to see your man, Captain. I think we may let him go tomorrow. These fools have no notion of taking care of themselves, though. I say, we've got the chief engineer of that pilgrim ship here. A curious case. DTs are the worst kind. He's been drinking hard in that Greeks or Italians' grog shop for 3 days. What can you expect? 4 bottles of that kind of brandy a day, I'm told. Wonderful, if true. Sheeted with boiler iron inside, I should think. The head, of course, gone. But the curious part is there's some sort of method in his raving. I'm trying to find out. Most unusual, that thread of logic in such a delirium. Traditionally, he ought to see snakes, but he doesn't. Good old traditions at a discount nowadays, eh? His visions are batrachian. No, seriously. I never remember being so interested in a case of Jim Jams before. He ought to be dead, don't you know, after such a festive experiment. Oh, he's a tough object. 24 years of the tropics, too. You ought really to take a peep at him. Noble-looking old boozer. Most extraordinary man I ever met. Medically, of course. Won't you?" I had been all along exhibiting the usual polite signs of interest, but now, assuming an air of regret, I murmured of want of time and shook hands in a hurry. "I say," he cried after me, "he can't attend that inquiry. Is his evidence material, do you think?" "Not in the least," I called back from the gateway. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 6. The authorities were evidently of the same opinion. The inquiry was not adjourned. It was held on the appointed day to satisfy the law, and it was well attended because of its human interest, no doubt. There was no incertitude as to the one material fact, I mean. How the Patna came by her hurt it was impossible to find out. The court did not expect to find out, and in the whole audience there was not a man who cared. Yet, as I've told you, all the sailors in the port attended, and the waterside business was fully represented. Whether they knew it or not, the interest that drew them here was purely psychological, the expectation of some essential disclosure as to the strength, the power, the horror of human emotions. Naturally, nothing of the kind could be disclosed. The examination of the only man able and willing to face it was beating futilely round the well-known fact, and the play of questions upon it was as instructive as the tapping with a hammer on an iron box with the object to find out what's inside. However, an official inquiry could not be any other thing. Its object was not the fundamental why, but the superficial how of this affair. The young chap could have told them, and though that very thing was the thing that interested the audience, the questions put to him necessarily led him away from what to me, for instance, would have been the only truth worth knowing. You can't expect the constituted authorities to inquire into the state of a man's soul, or is it only of his liver? Their business was to come down upon the consequences, and frankly, a casual police magistrate and 2 nautical assessors are not much good for anything else. I don't mean to imply these fellows were stupid. The magistrate was very patient. One of the assessors was a sailing ship skipper with a reddish beard and of a pious disposition. Brierly was the other, Big Brierly. Some of you must have heard of Big Brierly, the captain of the crack ship of the Blue Star Line. That's the man. He seemed consumedly bored by the honour thrust upon him. He had never in his life made a mistake, never had an accident, never a mishap, never a check in his steady rise, and he seemed to be one of those lucky fellows who know nothing of indecision, much less of self-mistrust. At 32 he had one of the best commands going in the Eastern trade, and what's more, he thought a lot of what he had. There was nothing like it in the world, and I suppose if you had asked him point blank he would have confessed that in his opinion there was not such another commander. The choice had fallen upon the right man. The rest of mankind that did not command the 16-knot steel steamer Ossa were rather poor creatures. He had saved lives at sea, had rescued ships in distress, had a gold chronometer presented to him by the underwriters, and a pair of binoculars with a suitable inscription from some foreign government in commemoration of these services. He was acutely aware of his merits and of his rewards. I liked him well enough, though some I know, meek, friendly men at that, couldn't stand him at any price. I haven't the slightest doubt he considered himself vastly my superior. Indeed, had you been Emperor of East and West, you could not have ignored your inferiority in his presence, but I couldn't get up any real sentiment of offence. He did not despise me for anything I could help, for anything I was, don't you know? I was a negligible quantity, simply because I was not the fortunate man of the earth, not Montague Brierly in command of the Ossa, not the owner of an inscribed gold chronometer and of silver-mounted binoculars testifying to the excellence of my seamanship and to my indomitable pluck, not possessed of an acute sense of my merits and of my rewards. Besides the love and worship of a black retriever, the most wonderful of its kind, for never was such a man loved thus by such a dog. No doubt, to have all this forced upon you was exasperating enough, but when I reflected that I was associated in these fatal disadvantages with 1,200 millions of other more or less human beings, I found I could bear my share of his good-natured and contemptuous pity for the sake of something indefinite and attractive in the man. I have never defined to myself this attraction, but there were moments when I envied him. The sting of life could do no more to his complacent soul than the scratch of a pin to the smooth face of a rock. This was enviable. As I looked at him, flanking on one side the unassuming, pale-faced magistrate who presided at the inquiry, his self-satisfaction presented to me and to the world a surface as hard as granite. He committed suicide very soon after. No wonder Jim's case bored him, and while I thought with something akin to fear of the immensity of his contempt for the young man under examination, he was probably holding silent inquiry into his own case. The verdict must have been of unmitigated guilt, and he took the secret of the evidence with him in that leap into the sea. If I understand anything of men, the matter was no doubt of the gravest import, one of those trifles that awaken ideas, start into life some thought which a man unused to such a companionship finds it impossible to live. I am in a position to know that it wasn't money, and it wasn't drink, and it wasn't woman. He jumped overboard at sea barely a week after the end of the inquiry, and less than 3 days after leaving port on his outward passage, as though on that exact spot in the midst of waters he had suddenly perceived the gates of the other world flung wide open for his reception. Yet it was not a sudden impulse. His grey-headed mate, a first-rate sailor and a nice old chap with strangers, but in his relations with his commander the surliest chief officer I've ever seen, would tell the story with tears in his eyes. It appears that when he came on deck in the morning, Brierly had been writing in the chart-room. It was 10 minutes to 4, he said, and the middle watch was not relieved yet, of course. He heard my voice on the bridge speaking to the second mate and called me in. I was loath to go, and that's the truth, Captain Marlowe. I couldn't stand poor Captain Brierly, I tell you with shame. We never know what a man is made of. He had been promoted over too many heads, not counting my own, and he had a damnable trick of making you feel small, nothing but by the way he said good morning. I never addressed him, sir, but on matters of duty, and then it was as much as I could do to keep a civil tongue in my head. He flattered himself there. I often wondered how Brierly could put up with his manners for more than half a voyage. I've a wife and children, he went on, and I had been 10 years in the company, always expecting the next command. More fool I. Says he, just like this, "Come in here, Mr. Jones," in that swagger voice of his. "Come in here, Mr. Jones." In I went. "We'll lay down her position," says he, stooping over the chart, a pair of dividers in hand. By the standing orders, the officer going off duty would have done that at the end of his watch. However, I said nothing and looked on while he marked off the ship's position with a tiny cross and wrote the date and the time. I can see him this moment writing his neat figures, 17:08:4 a.m. The year would be written in red ink at the top of the chart. He never used his charts more than a year, Captain Brierly didn't. I've the chart now. When he had done, he stands down, looking at the mark he had made and smiling to himself, then looks up at me. 32 miles more as she goes," says he, "and then we shall be clear, and you may alter the course 20 degrees to the southward." We were passing to the north of the Hector Bank that voyage. I said, "All right, sir," wondering what he was fussing about, since I had to call him before altering the course anyhow. Just then 8 bells were struck. We came out on the bridge, and the second mate, before going off, mentions in the usual way, 71 on the log. Captain Brierly looks at the compass and then all round. It was dark and clear, and all the stars were out as plain as on a frosty night in high latitudes. Suddenly he says with a sort of a little sigh, "I'm going aft, and shall set the log at 0 for you myself, so that there can be no mistake. 32 miles more on this course, and then you're safe. Let's see, the correction on the log is 6% additive. Say, then, 30 by the dial to run, and you may come 20 degrees to starboard at once. No use losing any distance, is there?" I'd never heard him talk so much at a stretch, and to no purpose as it seemed to me. I said nothing. He went down the ladder, and the dog that was always at his heels whenever he moved, night or day, followed, sliding nose first, after him. I heard his boot heels tap, tap on the after deck, then he stopped and spoke to the dog. "Go back, Rover. On the bridge, boy. Go on, get." Then he calls out to me from the dark, "Shut that dog up in the chart room, Mr. Jones, will you?" This was the last time I heard his voice, Captain Marlowe. These are the last words he spoke in the hearing of any living human being, sir. At this point the old chap's voice got quite unsteady. He was afraid the poor brute would jump after him, don't you see? He pursued with a quaver. "Yes, Captain Marlowe, he set the log for me. Would you believe it? He put a drop of oil in it, too. There was the oil feeder where he left it nearby. The boatswain's mate got the hose along aft to wash down at 5:30. By and by he knocks off and runs up to the bridge. 'Will you please call aft, Mr. Jones?' he says. 'There's a funny thing. I don't like to touch it.' It was Captain Briley's gold chronometer watch, carefully hung under the rail by its chain. As soon as my eyes fell on it, something struck me, and I knew. My legs got soft under me. It was as if I had seen him go over, and I could tell how far behind he was left, too. The taffrail logged marked 18 miles and 3/4, and 4 iron belaying pins were missing round the mainmast. Put them in his pockets to help him down, I suppose. But, Lord, what's 4 iron pins to a powerful man like Captain Briley? Maybe his confidence in himself was just shook a bit at the last. That's the only sign of fluster he gave in his whole life, I should think, but I'm ready to answer for him that once over he did not try to swim a stroke, the same as he would have had pluck enough to keep up all day long on the bare chance he had fallen overboard accidentally. Yes, sir, he was second to none, if he said so himself, as I heard him once. He had written 2 letters in the middle watch, one to the company and the other to me. He gave me a lot of instructions as to the passage. I'd been in the trade before he was out of his time, and no end of hints as to my conduct with our people in Shanghai, so that I should keep the command of the Ossa. He wrote like a father would to a favourite son, Captain Marlowe, and I was 25 years his senior, and had tasted salt water before he was fairly breeched. In his letter to the owners, it was left open for me to see. He said that he had always done his duty by them, up to that moment, and even now he was not betraying their confidence, since he was leaving the ship to as competent a seaman as could be found, meaning me, sir, meaning me. He told them that if the last act of his life didn't take away all his credit with them, they would give weight to my faithful service and to his warm recommendation when about to fill the vacancy made by his death. And much more like this, sir. I couldn't believe my eyes. It made me feel queer all over, went on the old chap, in great perturbation, and squashing something in the corner of his eye with the end of a thumb as broad as a spatula. You would think, sir, he had jumped overboard only to give an unlucky man a last show to get on. What with the shock of him going in this awful rash way, and thinking myself a made man by that chance, I was nearly off my chump for a week. But no fear. The captain of the Pelion was shifted into the Ossa, came aboard in Shanghai. A little popinjay, sir, in a great check suit with his hair parted in the middle. "I am your new captain, Mr. Jones." He was drowned in scent, fairly stunk with it, Captain Marlowe. I dare say it was the look I gave him that made him stammer. He mumbled something about my natural disappointment. I had better know at once that his chief officer got the promotion to the Pelion. He had nothing to do with it, of course. Supposed the office knew best. Sorry. Says I, "Don't you mind old Jones, sir, damn his soul. He's used to it." I could see directly I had shocked his delicate ear, and while we sat at our first tiffin together he began to find fault in a nasty manner with this and that in the ship. I never heard such a voice out of a Punch and Judy show. I set my teeth hard and glued my eyes to my plate and held my peace as long as I could, but at last I had to say something. Up he jumps, tiptoeing, ruffling all his pretty plumes like a little fighting cock. "You'll find you have a different person to deal with than the late Captain Briley." "I've found it," says I, very glum, but pretending to be mighty busy with my steak. "You are an old ruffian, Mr. Jones, and what's more, you are known for an old ruffian in the employ," he squeaks at me. The damn bottle washers stood about listening with their mouths stretched from ear to ear. "I may be a hard case," answers I, "but I ain't so far gone as to put up with the sight of you sitting in Captain Briley's chair." With that I lay down my knife and fork. "You would like to sit in it yourself. That's where the shoe pinches," he sneers. I left the saloon, got my rags together, and was on the quay with all my dunnage about my feet before the stevedores had turned to again. Yes, adrift, on shore, after 10 years' service, and with a poor woman and 4 children 6,000 miles off, depending on my half-pay for every mouthful they ate. Yes, sir. I chucked it rather than hear Captain Briley abused. He left me his night-glasses. Here they are. And he wished me to take care of the dog. Here he is. Hello, Rover, poor boy. Where's the captain, Rover? The dog looked up at us with mournful yellow eyes, gave one desolate bark, and crept under the table. All this was taking place more than 2 years afterwards. On board that nautical ruin, the Fire Queen, this Jones had got hold of, quite by a funny accident too, from Matheson. Mad Matheson, they generally called him. The same who used to hang out in High Fong, before the occupation days. The old chap snuffled on. "Aye, sir, Captain Briley will be remembered here if there's no other place on earth." I wrote fully to his father, and did not get a word in reply, neither thank you nor go to the devil, nothing. Perhaps they did not want to know. The sight of that watery-eyed old Jones mopping his bald head with a red cotton handkerchief, the sorrowing yelp of the dog, the squalor of that fly-blown cuddy, which was the only shrine of his memory, threw a veil of inexpressibly mean pathos over Briley's remembered figure, the posthumous revenge of fate for that belief in his own splendour which had almost cheated his life of its legitimate terrors. Almost, perhaps wholly. Who can tell what flattering view he had induced himself to take of his own suicide? "Why did he commit the rash act, Captain Marlowe? Can you think?" asked Jones, pressing his palms together. "Why? It beats me. Why?" He slapped his low and wrinkled forehead. "If he had been poor and old and in debt and never a show, or else mad, but he wasn't of the kind that goes mad, not he. You trust me. What a mate don't know about his skipper isn't worth knowing. Young, healthy, well off, no cares. I sit here sometimes thinking, till my head fairly begins to buzz. There was some reason." "You may depend on it, Captain Jones," said I. "It wasn't anything that would have disturbed much either of us two," I said. And then, as if a light had been flashed into the muddle of his brain, poor old Jones found a last word of amazing profundity. He blew his nose, nodding at me dolefully. "Aye, aye. Neither you nor I, sir, had ever thought so much of ourselves." Of course, the recollection of my last conversation with Briley is tinged with the knowledge of his end that followed so close upon it. I spoke with him for the last time during the progress of the inquiry. It was after the first adjournment, and he came up with me in the street. He was in a state of irritation, which I noticed with surprise, his usual behaviour when he condescended to converse being perfectly cool, with a trace of amused tolerance, as if the existence of his interlocutor had been a rather good joke. "They caught me for that inquiry, you see," he began, and for a while enlarged complainingly upon the inconvenience of daily attendance in court. "And goodness knows how long it will last. 3 days, I suppose." I heard him out in silence. In my then opinion, it was a way as good as another of putting on side. "What's the use of it? It is the stupidest set-out you can imagine," he pursued hotly. I remarked that there was no option. He interrupted me with a sort of pent-up violence. "I feel like a fool all the time." I looked up at him. This was going very far for Briley, when talking of Briley. He stopped short, and seizing the lapel of my coat, gave it a slight tug. "Why are we tormenting that young chap?" he asked. This question chimed in so well to the tolling of a certain thought of mine that, with the image of the absconding renegade in my eyes, I answered at once, "Hanged if I know, unless it be that he lets you." I was astonished to see him fall into line, so to speak, with that utterance, which ought to have been tolerably cryptic. He said angrily, "Why, yes, can't he see that wretched skipper of his has cleared out? What does he expect to happen? Nothing can save him. He's done for." We walked on in silence a few steps. "Why eat all that dirt?" he exclaimed, with an oriental energy of expression, about the only sort of energy you can find a trace of east of the 50th meridian. I wondered greatly at the direction of his thoughts, but now I strongly suspect it was strictly in character. At bottom, poor Brierly must have been thinking of himself. I pointed out to him that the skipper of the Patna was known to have feathered his nest pretty well, and could procure almost anywhere the means of getting away. With Jim it was otherwise. The government was keeping him in the sailors' home for the time being, and probably he hadn't a penny in his pocket to bless himself with. It cost some money to run away. "Does it? Not always," he said, with a bitter laugh, and to some further remark of mine, "Well then, let him creep 20 feet underground and stay there. By heavens, I would." I don't know why his tone provoked me, and I said, "There is a kind of courage in facing it out as he does, knowing very well that if he went away nobody would trouble to run after him." "Courage be hanged," growled Brierly. "That sort of courage is of no use to keep a man straight, and I don't care a snap for such courage. If you were to say it was a kind of cowardice now, of softness— I tell you what, I will put up 200 rupees if you put up another 100 and undertake to make the beggar clear out early tomorrow morning. The fellow's a gentleman if he ain't fit to be touched. He will understand. He must. This infernal publicity is too shocking. There he sits while all these confounded natives, serangs, lascars, quartermasters are giving evidence that's enough to burn a man to ashes with shame. This is abominable. Why, Marlowe, don't you feel that this is abominable? Don't you now? Come, as a seaman? If he went away, all this would stop at once." Brierly said these words with a most unusual animation, and made as if to reach after his pocket-book. I restrained him, and declared coldly that the cowardice of these 4 men did not seem to me a matter of such great importance. "And you call yourself a seaman, I suppose," he pronounced angrily. I said that's what I called myself, and I hoped I was too. He heard me out, and made a gesture with his big arm that seemed to deprive me of my individuality, to push me away into the crowd. "The worst of it," he said, "is that all you fellows have no sense of dignity. You don't think enough of what you are supposed to be." We'd been walking slowly meantime, and now stopped opposite the harbour office, in sight of the very spot from which the immense captain of the Patna had vanished as utterly as a tiny feather blown away in a hurricane. I smiled. Brierly went on, "This is a disgrace. We've got all kinds amongst us, some anointed scoundrels in the lot, but hang it, we must preserve professional decency, or we become no better than so many tinkers going about loose. We are trusted. Do you understand? Trusted. Frankly, I don't care a snap for all the pilgrims that ever came out of Asia, but a decent man would not have behaved like this to a full cargo of old rags in bales. We aren't an organised body of men, and the only thing that holds us together is just the name for that kind of decency. Such an affair destroys one's confidence. A man may go pretty near through his whole sea life without any call to show a stiff upper lip, but when the call comes— aha! If I— He broke off, and in a changed tone, "I'll give you 200 rupees now, Marlowe, and you just talk to that chap. Confound him. I wish he had never come out here. Fact is, I rather think some of my people know his. The old man's a parson, and I remember now I met him once when staying with my cousin in Essex last year. If I'm not mistaken, the old chap seemed rather to fancy his sailor son. Horrible. I can't do it myself, but you—" Thus, apropos of Jim, I had a glimpse of the real Brierly a few days before he committed his reality and his sham together to the keeping of the sea. Of course, I declined to meddle. The tone of his last "but you," poor Brierly couldn't help it, that seemed to imply I was no more noticeable than an insect, caused me to look at the proposal with indignation, and on account of that provocation, or for some other reason, I became positive in my mind that the inquiry was a severe punishment to that Jim, and that his facing it, practically of his own free will, was a redeeming feature in his abominable case. I hadn't been so sure of it before. Brierly went off in a huff. At the time his state of mind was more of a mystery to me than it is now. Next day, coming into court late, I sat by myself. Of course I could not forget the conversation I had with Brierly, and now I had them both under my eyes. The demeanour of one suggested gloomy impudence, and of the other a contemptuous boredom. Yet one attitude might not have been truer than the other, and I was aware that one was not true. Brierly was not bored, he was exasperated, and if so, then Jim might not have been impudent. According to my theory, he was not. I imagined he was hopeless. Then it was that our glances met. They met, and the look he gave me was discouraging of any intention I might have had to speak to him. Upon either hypothesis, insolence or despair, I felt I could be of no use to him. This was the second day of the proceedings. Very soon after that exchange of glances, the inquiry was adjourned again to the next day. The white men began to troop out at once. Jim had been told to stand down some time before, and was able to leave amongst the first. I saw his broad shoulders and his head outlined in the light of the door, and while I made my way slowly out, talking with some stranger who had addressed me casually, I could see him from within the courtroom, resting both elbows on the balustrade of the veranda and turning his back on the small stream of people trickling down the few steps. There was a murmur of voices and a shuffle of boots. The next case was that of assault and battery committed upon a money-lender, I believe, and the defendant, a venerable villager with a straight white beard, sat on a mat just outside the door with his sons, daughters, sons-in-law, their wives, and I should think half the population of his village besides, squatting or standing around him. A slim, dark woman, with part of her back and one black shoulder bared, and with a thin gold ring in her nose, suddenly began to talk in a high-pitched, shrewish tone. The man with me instinctively looked up at her. We were just then through the door, passing behind Jim's burly back. Whether those villagers had brought the yellow dog with them, I don't know. Anyhow, a dog was there, weaving himself in and out amongst people's legs in that mute, stealthy way native dogs have, and my companion stumbled over him. The dog leapt away without a sound. The man, raising his voice a little, said with a slow laugh, "Look at that wretched cur," and directly afterwards we became separated by a lot of people pushing in. I stood back for a moment against the wall while the stranger managed to get down the steps and disappeared. I saw Jim spin round. He made a step forward and barred my way. We were alone. He glared at me with an air of stubborn resolution. I became aware that I was being held up, so to speak, as if in a wood. The veranda was empty by then. The noise and movement in court had ceased. A great silence fell upon the building, in which, somewhere far within, an oriental voice began to whine abjectly. The dog, in the very act of trying to sneak in at the door, sat down hurriedly to hunt for fleas. "Did you speak to me?" asked Jim, very low, and bending forward, not so much towards me, but at me, if you know what I mean. I said no at once. Something in the sound of that quiet tone of his warned me to be on my defence. I watched him. It was very much like a meeting in a wood, only more uncertain in its issue, since he could possibly want neither my money nor my life, nothing that I could simply give up or defend with a clear conscience. "You say you didn't," he said, very sombre, "but I heard." "Some mistake," I protested, utterly at a loss, and never taking my eyes off him. To watch his face was like watching a darkening sky before a clap of thunder. Shade upon shade, imperceptibly coming on, the doom growing mysteriously intense in the calm of maturing violence. "As far as I know, I haven't opened my lips in your hearing," I affirmed with perfect truth. I was getting a little angry too at the absurdity of this encounter. It strikes me now I have never in my life been so near a beating. I mean it literally, a beating with fists. I suppose I had some hazy prescience of that eventuality being in the air. Not that he was actively threatening me. On the contrary, he was strangely passive, don't you know. But he was lowering, and though not exceptionally big, he looked generally fit to demolish a wall. The most reassuring symptom I noticed was a kind of slow and ponderous hesitation, which I took as a tribute to the evident sincerity of my manner and of my tone. We faced each other. In the court the assault case was proceeding. I caught the words, "Well, buffalo, stick," in the greatness of my fear. "What did you mean by staring at me all the morning?" said Jim at last. He looked up and looked down again. "Did you expect us all to sit with downcast eyes out of regard for your susceptibilities?" I retorted sharply. I was not going to submit meekly to any of his nonsense. He raised his eyes again, and this time continued to look me straight in the face. "No, that's all right," he pronounced with an air of deliberating with himself upon the truth of this statement. "That's all right. I'm going through with that, only," and there he spoke a little faster, "I won't let any man call me names outside this court. There was a fellow with you. You spoke to him. Oh, yes, I know. 'Tis all very fine. You spoke to him, but you meant me to hear." I assured him he was under some extraordinary delusion. I had no conception how it came about. "You thought I would be afraid to resent this," he said, with just a faint tinge of bitterness. I was interested enough to discern the slightest shades of expression, but I was not in the least enlightened. Yet I don't know what in these words, or perhaps just the intonation of that phrase, induced me suddenly to make all possible allowances for him. I ceased to be annoyed at my unexpected predicament. It was some mistake on his part. He was blundering, and I had an intuition that the blunder was of an odious, of an unfortunate nature. I was anxious to end this scene on grounds of decency, just as one is anxious to cut short some unprovoked and abominable confidence. The funniest part was that in the midst of all these considerations of the higher order I was conscious of a certain trepidation as to the possibility, nay, likelihood, of this encounter ending in some disreputable brawl which could not possibly be explained, and would make me ridiculous. I did not hanker after a 3 days' celebrity as the man who got a black eye or something of the sort from the mate of the Patna. He, in all probability, did not care what he did, or at any rate would be fully justified in his own eyes. It took no magician to see he was amazingly angry about something, for all his quiet and even torpid demeanour. I don't deny I was extremely desirous to pacify him at all costs, had I only known what to do. But I didn't know, as you may well imagine. It was a blackness without a single gleam. We confronted each other in silence. He hung fire for about 15 seconds, then made a step nearer, and I made ready to ward off a blow, though I don't think I moved a muscle. "If you were as big as 2 men and as strong as 6, he said very softly, "I would tell you what I think of you. You—" "Stop!" I exclaimed. This checked him for a second. "Before you tell me what you think of me," I went on quickly, "will you kindly tell me what it is I've said or done?" During the pause that ensued, he surveyed me with indignation, while I made supernatural efforts of memory, in which I was hindered by the oriental voice within the courtroom, expostulating with impassioned volubility against a charge of falsehood. Then we spoke almost together. "I will soon show you I am not," he said, in a tone suggestive of a crisis. "I declare I don't know," I protested earnestly at the same time. He tried to crush me by the scorn of his glance. "Now that you see I am not afraid, you try to crawl out of it," he said. "Who's a cur now, hey?" And then at last I understood. He had been scanning my features as though looking for a place where he would plant his fist. "I will allow no man," he mumbled threateningly. It was indeed a hideous mistake. He had given himself away utterly. I can't give you an idea how shocked I was. I suppose he saw some reflection of my feelings in my face, because his expression changed just a little. "Good God," I stammered, "you don't think I—" "But I'm sure I heard," he persisted, raising his voice for the first time since the beginning of this deplorable scene. Then, with a shade of disdain, he added, "It wasn't you, then? Very well. I'll find the other." "Don't be a fool," I cried in exasperation. "It wasn't that at all." "I've heard," he said again, with an unshaken and sombre perseverance. There may be those who could have laughed at his pertinacity. I didn't. Oh, I didn't. There had never been a man so mercilessly shown up by his own natural impulse. A single word had stripped him of his discretion, of that discretion which is more necessary to the decencies of our inner being than clothing is to the decorum of our body. "Don't be a fool," I repeated. "But the other man said it. You don't deny that?" he pronounced distinctly, and looking in my face without flinching. "No, I don't deny," said I, returning his gaze. At last his eyes followed downward the direction of my pointing finger. He appeared at first uncomprehending, then confounded, and at last amazed and scared, as though a dog had been a monster, and he had never seen a dog before. "Nobody dreamt of insulting you," I said. He contemplated the wretched animal that moved no more than an effigy. It sat with ears pricked and its sharp muzzle pointed into the doorway, and suddenly snapped at a fly like a piece of mechanism. I looked at him. The red of his fair, sunburnt complexion deepened suddenly under the down of his cheeks, invaded his forehead, spread to the roots of his curly hair. His ears became intensely crimson, and even the clear blue of his eyes was darkened many shades by the rush of blood to his head. His lips pouted a little, trembling as though he had been on the point of bursting into tears. I perceived he was incapable of pronouncing a word from the excess of this humiliation. From disappointment, too. Who knows? Perhaps he looked forward to that hammering he was going to give me for rehabilitation, for appeasement. Who can tell what relief he expected from this chance of a row? He was naive enough to expect anything, but he had given himself away for nothing in this case. He had been frank with himself, let alone with me, in the wild hope of arriving in that way at some effective refutation, and the stars had been ironically unpropitious. He made an inarticulate noise in his throat like a man imperfectly stunned by a blow on the head. It was pitiful. I didn't catch up again with him till well outside the gate. I had even to trot a bit at the last, but when, out of breath at his elbow, I taxed him with running away, he said, "Never," and at once turned at bay. I explained I never meant to say he was running away from me. From no man, from not a single man on earth, he affirmed with a stubborn mien. I forbore to point out the one obvious exception which would hold good for the bravest of us. I thought he would find out by himself very soon. He looked at me patiently while I was thinking of something to say, but I could find nothing on the spur of the moment, and he began to walk on. I kept up, and, anxious not to lose him, I said hurriedly that I couldn't think of leaving him under a false impression of my... I stammered. The stupidity of the phrase appalled me while I was trying to finish it, but the power of sentences had nothing to do with their sense or the logic of their construction. My idiotic mumble seemed to please him. He cut it short by saying, with courteous placidity that argued an immense power of self-control, or else a wonderful elasticity of spirits, "Altogether my mistake." I marvelled greatly at this expression. He might have been alluding to some trifling occurrence. Hadn't he understood its deplorable meaning? "You may well forgive me," he continued, and went on a little moodily. "All these staring people in court seem such fools that it might have been as I supposed." This opened suddenly a new view of him to my wonder. I looked at him curiously, and met his unabashed and impenetrable eyes. "I can't put up with this kind of thing," he said, very simply, "and I don't mean to. In court it's different. I've got to stand that, and I can do it too." I don't pretend I understood him. The views he let me have of himself were like those glimpses through the shifting rents in a thick fog, bits of vivid and vanishing detail, giving no connected idea of the general aspect of a country. They fed one's curiosity without satisfying it. They were no good for purposes of orientation. Upon the whole, he was misleading. That's how I summed him up to myself after he left me late in the evening. I had been staying at the Malabar House for a few days, and on my pressing invitation he dined with me there. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 7. An outward-bound mail-boat had come in that afternoon, and the big dining-room of the hotel was more than half full of people with £100 round-the-world tickets in their pockets. There were married couples looking domesticated and bored with each other in the midst of their travels. There were small parties and large parties, and lone individuals dining solemnly or feasting boisterously, but all thinking, conversing, joking, or scowling, as was their wont at home, and just as intelligently receptive of new impressions as their trunks upstairs. Henceforth they would be labelled as having passed through this and that place, and so would be their luggage. They would cherish this distinction of their persons, and preserve the gummed tickets on their portmanteaus as documentary evidence, as the only permanent trace of their improving enterprise. The dark-faced servants tripped without noise over the vast and polished floor. Now and then a girl's laugh would be heard, as innocent and empty as her mind. Or, in a sudden hush of crockery, a few words in an affected drawl from some wit, embroidering for the benefit of a grinning tableful the last funny story of shipboard scandal. Two nomadic old maids dressed up to kill worked acrimoniously through the bill of fare, whispering to each other with faded lips, wooden-faced and bizarre, like two sumptuous scarecrows. A little wine opened Jim's heart and loosened his tongue. His appetite was good too, I noticed. He seemed to have buried somewhere the opening episode of our acquaintance. It was like a thing of which there would be no more question in this world. And all the time I had before me these blue, boyish eyes looking straight into mine, this young face, these capable shoulders, the open, bronzed forehead with a white line under the roots of clustering fair hair, this appearance appealing at sight to all my sympathies, this frank aspect, the artless smile, the youthful seriousness. He was of the right sort. He was one of us. He talked soberly, with a sort of composed unreserve, and with a quiet bearing that might have been the outcome of manly self-control, of impudence, of callousness, of a colossal unconsciousness, of a gigantic deception. Who can tell? From our tone we might have been discussing a third person, a football match, last year's weather. My mind floated in a sea of conjectures till the turn of the conversation enabled me, without being offensive, to remark that, upon the whole, this inquiry must have been pretty trying for him. He darted his arm across the tablecloth, and, clutching my hand by the side of my plate, glared fixedly. I was startled. "It must be awfully hard," I stammered, confused by this display of speechless feeling. "It is hell," he burst out in a muffled voice. This movement and these words caused two well-groomed male globe-trotters at a neighbouring table to look up in alarm from their iced pudding. I rose, and we passed into the front gallery for coffee and cigars. On little octagon tables candles burned in glass globes. Clumps of stiff-leaved plants separated sets of cosy wicker chairs, and between the pairs of columns, whose reddish shafts caught in a long row the sheen from the tall windows, the night, glittering and sombre, seemed to hang like a splendid drapery. The riding lights of ships winked afar like setting stars, and the hills across the roadstead resembled rounded black masses of arrested thunderclouds. "I couldn't clear out," Jim began. "The skipper did. That's all very well for him. I couldn't, and I wouldn't. They all got out of it one way or another, but it wouldn't do for me." I listened with concentrated attention, not daring to stir in my chair. I wanted to know, and to this day I don't know. I can only guess. He would be confident and depressed all in the same breath, as if some conviction of innate blamelessness had checked the truth writhing within him at every turn. He began by saying, in the tone in which a man would admit his inability to jump a 20-foot wall, that he could never go home now, and this declaration recalled to my mind what Brierly had said, that the old parson in Essex seemed to fancy his sailor son not a little. I can't tell you whether Jim knew he was especially fancied, but the tone of his references to my dad was calculated to give me a notion that the good old rural dean was about the finest man that ever had been worried by the cares of a large family since the beginning of the world. This, though never stated, was implied with an anxiety that there should be no mistake about it, which was really very true and charming, but added a poignant sense of lives far off to the other elements of the story. "He has seen it in all the home papers by this time," said Jim. "I can never face the poor old chap." I did not dare to lift my eyes at this till I heard him add, "I could never explain. He wouldn't understand." Then I looked up. He was smoking reflectively, and after a moment, rousing himself, began to talk again. He discovered at once a desire that I should not confound him with his partners in crime, let us call it. He was not one of them. He was altogether of another sort. I gave no sign of dissent. I had no intention, for the sake of barren truth, to rob him of the smallest particle of any saving grace that would come in his way. I didn't know how much of it he believed himself. I didn't know what he was playing up to, if he was playing up to anything at all, and I suspect he did not know either, for it is my belief no man ever understands quite his own artful dodges to escape from the grim shadow of self-knowledge. I made no sound all the time he was wondering what he had better do after that stupid inquiry was over. Apparently he shared Brierly's contemptuous opinion of these proceedings ordained by law. He would not know where to turn, he confessed, clearly thinking aloud rather than talking to me. Certificate gone, career broken, no money to get away, no work that he could obtain as far as he could see. At home he could perhaps get something, but it meant going to his people for help, and that he would not do. He saw nothing for it but ship before the mast, Could perhaps get a quartermaster's billet in some steamer. Would do for a quartermaster. "Do you think you would?" I asked pitilessly. He jumped up and, going to the stone balustrade, looked out into the night. In a moment he was back, towering above my chair, with his youthful face clouded yet by the pain of a conquered emotion. He had understood very well I did not doubt his ability to steer a ship. In a voice that quavered a bit, he asked me, why did I say that? I had been no end kind to him. I had not even laughed at him when, here he began to mumble, that mistake, made a confounded ass of myself. I broke in by saying rather warmly that for me such a mistake was not a matter to laugh at. He sat down and drank deliberately some coffee, emptying the small cup to the last drop. "That does not mean, I admit for a moment, the cap fitted," he declared distinctly. "No?" I said. "No," he affirmed with quiet decision. "Do you know what you would have done? Do you? And you don't think yourself—" he gulped something. "You don't think yourself a cur?" And with this, upon my honour, he looked up at me inquisitively. It was a question, it appears, a bona fide question. However, he didn't wait for an answer. Before I could recover, he went on, with his eyes straight before him, as if reading off something written on the body of the night. "It is all in being ready. I wasn't. Not then. I don't want to excuse myself, but I would like to explain. I would like somebody to understand. Somebody. One person at least. You. Why not you?" It was solemn and a little ridiculous too, as they always are, those struggles of an individual trying to save from the fire his idea of what his moral identity should be, this precious notion of a convention, only one of the rules of the game, nothing more, but all the same so terribly effective by its assumption of unlimited power over natural instincts, by the awful penalties of its failure. He began his story quietly enough. On board that Dale-Line steamer that had picked up these four floating in a boat upon the discreet sunset glow of the sea, they had been, after the first day, looked askance upon. The fat skipper told some story, the others had been silent, and at first it had been accepted. You don't cross-examine poor castaways you had the good luck to save, if not from cruel death, then at least from cruel suffering. Afterwards, with time to think it over, it might have struck the officers of the Avondale that there was something fishy in the affair, but of course they would keep their doubts to themselves. They had picked up the captain, the mate, and 2 engineers of the steamer Patna, sunk at sea, and that, very properly, was enough for them. I did not ask Jim about the nature of his feelings during the 10 days he spent on board. From the way he narrated that part, I was at liberty to infer he was partly stunned by the discovery he had made, the discovery about himself, and no doubt was at work trying to explain it away to the only man who was capable of appreciating all its tremendous magnitude. You must understand, he did not try to minimize its importance. Of that I am sure, and therein lies his distinction. As to what sensations he experienced when he got ashore and heard the unforeseen conclusion of the tale in which he had taken such a pitiful part, he told me nothing of them, and it is difficult to imagine. I wonder whether he felt the ground cut from under his feet. I wonder. But no doubt he managed to get a fresh foothold very soon. He was ashore a whole fortnight waiting in the sailors' home, and as there were 6 or 7 men staying there at the time, I had heard of him a little. Their languid opinion seemed to be that, in addition to his other shortcomings, he was a sulky brute. He had passed these days on the veranda, buried in a long chair, and coming out of his place of sepulture only at meal-times or late at night, when he wandered on the quays all by himself, detached from his surroundings, irresolute and silent, like a ghost without a home to haunt. "I don't think I've spoken 3 words to a living soul in all that time," he said, making me very sorry for him. And directly he added, "One of these fellows would have been sure to blurt out something I had made up my mind not to put up with, and I didn't want a row. No, not then. I was I had no heart for it." "So that bulkhead held out after all," I remarked cheerfully. "Yes," he murmured, "it held. And yet, I swear to you, I felt it bulge under my hand." "It's extraordinary what strains old iron will stand sometimes," I said. Thrown back in his seat, his legs stiffly out and arms hanging down, he nodded slightly several times. You could not conceive a sadder spectacle. Suddenly he lifted his head. He sat up. He slapped his thigh. "Ah, what a chance missed! My God, what a chance missed!" he blazed out, but the ring of the last "missed" resembled a cry wrung out by pain. He was silent again, with a still, far-away look of fierce yearning after that missed distinction, with his nostrils for an instant dilated, sniffing the intoxicating breath of that wasted opportunity. If you think I was either surprised or shocked, you do me an injustice in more ways than one. Ah, he was an imaginative beggar. He would give himself away. He would give himself up. I could see in his glance, darted into the night, all his inner being carried on, projected headlong into the fanciful realm of recklessly heroic aspirations. He had no leisure to regret what he had lost. He was so wholly and naturally concerned for what he had failed to obtain. He was very far away from me, who watched him across 3 feet of space. With every instant he was penetrating deeper into the impossible world of romantic achievements. He got to the heart of it at last. A strange look of beatitude overspread his features. His eyes sparkled in the light of the candle burning between us. He positively smiled. He had penetrated to the very heart, to the very heart. It was an ecstatic smile that your face, or mine either, will never wear, my dear boys. I whisked him back by saying, "If you had stuck to the ship, you mean?" He turned upon me, his eyes suddenly amazed and full of pain, with a bewildered, startled, suffering face, as though he had tumbled down from a star. "Neither you nor I will ever look like this on any man." He shuddered profoundly, as if a cold fingertip had touched his heart. Last of all he sighed. I was not in a merciful mood. He provoked one by his contradictory indiscretions. "It is unfortunate you didn't know beforehand," I said, with every unkind intention, but the perfidious shaft fell harmless, dropped at his feet like a spent arrow, as it were, and he did not think of picking it up. Perhaps he had not even seen it. Presently, lolling at ease, he said, "Dash it all, I tell you it bulged. I was holding up my lamp along the angle iron in the lower deck when a flake of rust as big as the palm of my hand fell off the plate, all of itself." He passed his hand over his forehead. "The thing stirred and jumped off like something alive while I was looking at it." "That made you feel pretty bad," I observed casually. "Do you suppose," he said, "that I was thinking of myself, with 160 people at my back, all fast asleep in that fore-tween deck alone, and more of them aft, more on the deck, sleeping, knowing nothing about it, 3 times as many as there were boats for, even if there had been time? I expected to see the iron open out while I stood there, and the rush of water going over them as they lay. What could I do? What?" I can easily picture him to myself in the peopled gloom of the cavernous place, with the light of the globe lamp falling on a small portion of the bulkhead that had the weight of the ocean on the other side, and the breathing of unconscious sleepers in his ears. I can see him glaring at the iron, startled by the falling rust, overburdened by the knowledge of an imminent death. This, I gathered, was the second time he had been sent forward by that skipper of his, who, I rather think, wanted to keep him away from the bridge. He told me that his first impulse was to shout and straightway make all those people leap out of sleep into terror, but such an overwhelming sense of his helplessness came over him that he was not able to produce a sound. This is, I suppose, what people mean by the tongue cleaving to the roof of the mouth. "Too dry" was the concise expression he used in reference to this state. Without a sound, then, he scrambled out on deck through the No. 1 hatch. A windsail rigged down there swung against him accidentally, and he remembered that the light touch of the canvas on his face nearly knocked him off the hatchway ladder. He confessed that his knees wobbled a good deal as he stood on the foredeck looking at another sleeping crowd. The engines having been stopped by that time, the steam was blowing off. Its deep rumble made the whole night vibrate like a bass string. The ship trembled to it. He saw here and there a head lifted off a mat, a vague form uprise in sitting posture, listen sleepily for a moment, sink down again into the billowy confusion of boxes, steam winches, ventilators. He was aware all these people did not know enough to take intelligent notice of that strange noise. The ship of iron, the men with white faces, all the sights, all the sounds, everything on board to that ignorant and pious multitude was strange alike, and as trustworthy as it would forever remain incomprehensible. It occurred to him that the fact was fortunate. The idea of it was simply terrible. You must remember he believed, as any other man would have done in his place, that the ship would go down at any moment. The bulging, rust-eaten plates that kept back the ocean fatally must give way all at once like an undermined dam, and let in a sudden and overwhelming flood. He stood still, looking at these recumbent bodies, a doomed man, aware of his fate, surveying the silent company of the dead. They were dead. Nothing could save them. There were boats enough for half of them, perhaps, but there was no time. No time. No time. It did not seem worthwhile to open his lips, to stir hand or foot. Before he could shout 3 words or make 3 steps, he would be floundering in a sea whitened awfully by the desperate struggles of human beings, clamorous with the distress of cries for help. There was no help. He imagined what would happen perfectly. He went through it all motionless by the hatchway with a lamp in his hand. He went through it to the very last harrowing detail. I think he went through it again while he was telling me these things he could not tell the court. I saw as clearly as you see now that there was nothing I could do. It seemed to take all life out of my limbs. I thought I might just as well stand where I was and wait. I did not think I had many seconds. Suddenly the steam ceased blowing off. The noise, he remarked, had been distracting, but the silence at once became intolerably oppressive. I thought I would choke before I got drowned, he said. He protested he did not think of saving himself. The only distinct thought formed, vanishing and reforming in his brain was 800 people and 7 boats. 800 people and 7 boats. Somebody was speaking aloud inside my head, he said a little wildly. 800 people and 7 boats and no time. Just think of it. He leaned towards me across the little table, and I tried to avoid his stare. "Do you think I was afraid of death?" he asked in a voice very fierce and low. He brought down his open hand with a bang that made the coffee cups dance. "I'm ready to swear I was not. I was not. By God, no!" He hitched himself upright and crossed his arms. His chin fell on his breast. The soft clashes of crockery reached us faintly through the high windows. There was a burst of voices, and several men came out in high good humour into the gallery. They were exchanging jocular reminiscences of the donkeys in Cairo. A pale, anxious youth, stepping softly on long legs, was being chaffed by a strutting and rubicund globe-trotter about his purchases in the bazaar. "No, really, do you think I've been done to that extent?" he inquired, very earnest and deliberate. The band moved away, dropping into chairs as they went. Matches flared, illuminating for a second faces without the ghost of an expression, and the flat glaze of white shirt fronts. The hum of many conversations, animated with the ardour of feasting, sounded to me absurd and infinitely remote. "Some of the crew are sleeping on the number 1 hatch within reach of my arm," began Jim again. "You must know they kept Kalashi watch in that ship, all hands sleeping through the night, and only the reliefs of quartermasters and lookout men being called." He was tempted to grip and shake the shoulders of the nearest Lascar, but he didn't. Something held his arms down along his sides. He was not afraid. Oh, no, only he just couldn't, that's all. He was not afraid of death, perhaps, but I'll tell you what, he was afraid of the emergency. His confounded imagination had evoked for him all the horrors of panic, the trampling rush, the pitiful screams, boats swamped, all the appalling incidents of a disaster at sea he had ever heard of. He might have been resigned to die, but I suspect he wanted to die without added terrors, quietly, in a sort of peaceful trance. A certain readiness to perish is not so very rare, but it is seldom that you meet men whose souls, steeled in the impenetrable armour of resolution, are ready to fight a losing battle to the last. The desire of peace waxes stronger as hope declines, till at last it conquers the very desire of life. Which of us here has not observed this, or maybe experienced something of that feeling in his own person, this extreme weariness of emotions, the vanity of effort, the yearning for rest? Those striving with unreasonable forces know it well. The shipwrecked castaways in boats, wanderers lost in a desert, Men battling against the unthinking might of nature, or the stupid brutality of crowds. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 8. How long he stood stock-still by the hatch, expecting every moment to feel the ship dip under his feet and the rush of water take him at the back and toss him like a chip, I cannot say. Not very long. 2 minutes, perhaps. A couple of men he could not make out began to converse drowsily, and also, he could not tell where, he detected a curious noise of shuffling feet. Above these faint sounds there was that awful stillness preceding a catastrophe, that trying silence of the moment before the crash. Then it came into his head that perhaps he would have time to rush along and cut all the lanyards of the gripes so that the boats would float as the ship went down. The Patna had a long bridge, and all the boats were up there, 4 on one side and 3 on the other, the smallest of them on the port side and nearly abreast of the steering gear. He assured me, with evident anxiety to be believed, that he had been most careful to keep them ready for instant service. He knew his duty. I dare say he was a good enough mate as far as that went. I always believed in being prepared for the worst, he commented, staring anxiously in my face. I nodded my approval of the sound principle, averting my eyes before the subtle unsoundness of the man. He started unsteadily to run. He had to step over legs, avoid stumbling against the heads. Suddenly someone caught hold of his coat from below, and a distressed voice spoke under his elbow. The light of the lamp he carried in his right hand fell upon an upturned dark face whose eyes entreated him together with the voice. He had picked up enough of the language to understand the word water, repeated several times in a tone of insistence, of prayer, almost of despair. He gave a jerk to get away, and felt an arm embrace his leg. "The beggar clung to me like a drowning man," he said impressively. "Water! Water!" What water did he mean? What did he know? As calmly as I could, I ordered him to let go. He was stopping me. Time was pressing. Other men began to stir. I wanted time to cut the boats adrift. He got hold of my hand now, and I felt that he would begin to shout. It flashed upon me it was enough to start a panic, and I hauled off with my free arm and slung the lamp in his face. The glass jingled, the light went out, but the blow made him let go, and I ran off. I wanted to get at the boats. I wanted to get at the boats. He leapt after me from behind. I turned on him. He would not keep quiet. He tried to shout. I had half throttled him before I made out what he wanted. He wanted some water to drink. They were on strict allowance, you know, and he had with him a young boy I had noticed several times. His child was sick and thirsty. He had caught sight of me as I passed by and was begging for a little water, that's all. We were under the bridge, in the dark. He kept on snatching at my wrists. There was no getting rid of him. I dashed into my berth, grabbed my water bottle and thrust it into his hands. He vanished. I didn't find out till then how much I was in want of a drink myself. He leaned on one elbow with a hand over his eyes. I felt a creepy sensation all down my backbone. There was something peculiar in all this. The fingers of the hand that shaded his brow trembled slightly. He broke the short silence. "These things happen only once to a man, and... oh, well. When I got on the bridge at last, the beggars were getting one of the boats off the chocks. A boat! I was running up the ladder when a heavy blow fell on my shoulder, just missing my head. It didn't stop me, and the chief engineer, they'd got him out of his bunk by then, raised the boat stretcher again. Somehow I had no mind to be surprised at anything. All this seemed natural and awful. And awful. I dodged that miserable maniac, lifted him off the deck as though he had been a little child, and he started whispering in my arms, Don't! I thought you were one of them niggers." I flung him away. He skidded along the bridge and knocked the legs from under the little chap, the second. The skipper, busy about the boat, looked round and came at me head down, growling like a wild beast. I flinched no more than a stone. I was as solid standing there as this. He tapped lightly with his knuckles the wall beside his chair. It was as though I had heard it all, seen it all, gone through it all 20 times already. I wasn't afraid of them. I drew back my fist, and he stopped short, muttering, "Ah, it's you. Lend me a hand, quick." That's what he said, quick, as if anybody could be quick enough. "Aren't you going to do something?" I asked. "Yes, clear out," he snarled over his shoulder. I don't think I understood then what he meant. The other two had picked themselves up by that time, and they rushed together to the boat. They tramped, they wheezed, they shoved, they cursed the boat, the ship, each other, cursed me, all in mutters. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I watched the slant of the ship. She was as still as if landed on the blocks in a dry dock, only she was like this. He held up his hand, palm under, the tips of his fingers inclined downwards. "Like this," he repeated. "I could see the line of the horizon before me, as clear as a bell, above her stem-head. I could see the water far off there, black and sparkling, and still, still as a pond, deadly still, more still than ever sea was before, more still than I could bear to look at. Have you watched a ship floating head down, checked in sinking by a sheet of old iron too rotten to stand being shored up? Have you? Oh, yes, shored up. I thought of that. I thought of every mortal thing. But can you shore up a bulkhead in 5 minutes? Or in 50, for that matter? Where was I going to get men that would go down below? And the timber? The timber! Would you have had the courage to swing them all for the first blow if you had seen that bulkhead? Don't say you would. You had not seen it. Nobody would. Hang it, to do a thing like that you must believe there is a chance, 1 in 1,000 at least, some ghost of a chance, and you would not have believed. Nobody would have believed. You think me a cur for standing there, but what would you have done? What? You can't tell. Nobody can tell. One must have time to turn round. What would you have me do? Where was the kindness in making crazy with fright all those people I could not save single-handed, that nothing could save? Look here, as true as I sit on this chair before you." He drew quick breaths at every few words and shot quick glances at my face, as though in his anguish he were watchful of the effect. He was not speaking to me. He was only speaking before me, in a dispute with an invisible personality, an antagonistic and inseparable partner of his existence, another possessor of his soul. These were issues beyond the competency of a court of inquiry. It was a subtle and momentous quarrel as to the true essence of life, and did not want a judge. He wanted an ally, a helper, an accomplice. I felt the risk I ran of being circumvented, blinded, decoyed, bullied perhaps into taking a definite part in a dispute impossible decision, if one had to be fair to all the phantoms in possession, to the reputable that had its claims and to the disreputable that had its exigencies. I can't explain to you who haven't seen him and who hear his words only at second hand the mixed nature of my feelings. It seemed to me I was being made to comprehend the inconceivable, and I know of nothing to compare with the discomfort of such a sensation. I was made to look at the convention that lurks in all truth and on the essential sincerity of falsehood. He appealed to all sides at once, to the side turned perpetually to the light of day, and to that side of us which, like the other hemisphere of the moon, exists stealthily in perpetual darkness, with only a fearful ashy light falling at times on the edge. He swayed me. I own to it. I own up. The occasion was obscure, insignificant, what you will. A lost youngster, 1 in a million. But then he was one of us. An incident as completely devoid of importance as the flooding of an ant-heap, and yet the mystery of his attitude got hold of me as though he had been an individual in the forefront of his kind, as if the obscure truth involved were momentous enough to affect mankind's conception of itself. Mollo paused to put new life into his expiring cheroot, seemed to forget all about the story, and abruptly began again. "My fault, of course. One has no business really to get interested. It's a weakness of mine. His was of another kind. My weakness consists in not having a discriminating eye for the incidental, for the externals, no eye for the hod of the rag-picker or the fine linen of the next man. Next man, that's it. I've met so many men," he pursued with momentary sadness. "Met them, too, with a certain impact, let us say. Like this fellow, for instance. And in each case all I could see was merely the human being. A confounded democratic quality of vision, which may be better than total blindness, but has been of no advantage to me, I can assure you. Men expect one to take into account their fine linen, but I never could get up any enthusiasm about these things. Oh, it's a failing. It's a failing. And then comes a soft evening, a lot of men too indolent for whist. and a story." He paused again to wait for an encouraging remark, perhaps, but nobody spoke. Only the host, as if reluctantly performing a duty, murmured, "You are so subtle, Marlowe." "Oh, I," said Marlowe in a low voice. "Oh, no." But he was. And try as I may for the success of this yarn, I'm missing innumerable shades. They were so fine, so difficult to render in colourless words. Because he complicated matters by being so simple, too. The simplest, poor devil. By Jove, he was amazing. There he sat telling me that just as I saw him before my eyes he wouldn't be afraid to face anything, and believing in it too. I tell you, it was fabulously innocent, and it was enormous. Enormous. I watched him covertly, just as though I had suspected him of an intention to take a jolly good rise out of me. He was confident that on the square, mind, there was nothing he couldn't meet. Ever since he had been so high, quite a little chap, he had been preparing himself for all the difficulties that can beset one on land and water. He confessed proudly to this kind of foresight. He had been elaborating dangers and defences, expecting the worst, rehearsing his best. He must have led a most exalted existence. Can you fancy it? A succession of adventures, so much glory, such a victorious progress, and the deep sense of his sagacity crowning every day of his inner life. He forgot himself, his eyes shone, and with every word my heart, searched by the light of his absurdity, was growing heavier in my breast. I had no mind to laugh, and lest I should smile I made for myself a stolid face. He gave signs of irritation. "It is always the unexpected that happens," I said in a propitiatory tone. My obtuseness provoked him into a contemptuous "Pshaw!" I suppose he meant that the unexpected couldn't touch him. Nothing less than the unconceivable itself could get over his perfect state of preparation. He had been taken unawares, and he whispered to himself a malediction upon the waters and the firmament, upon the ship, upon the men. Everything had betrayed him. He had been tricked into that sort of high-minded resignation which prevented him lifting as much as his little finger, while these others, who had a very clear perception of the actual necessity, were tumbling against each other and sweating desperately over that boat business. Something had gone wrong there at the last moment. It appears that in their flurry they had contrived in some mysterious way to get the sliding bolt of the foremost boat-chock jammed tight, and forthwith had gone out of the remnants of their minds over the deadly nature of that accident. It must have been a pretty sight, the fierce industry of these beggars toiling on a motionless ship that floated quietly in the silence of a world asleep, fighting against time for the freeing of that boat, grovelling on all fours, standing up in despair, tugging, pushing, snarling at each other venomously, ready to kill, ready to weep, and only kept from flying at each other's throats by the fear of death that stood silent behind them like an inflexible and cold-eyed taskmaster. Oh, yes, it must have been a pretty sight. He saw it all. He could talk about it with scorn and bitterness. He had a minute knowledge of it by means of some sixth sense, I conclude, because he swore to me he had remained apart without a glance at them, and at the boat, without one single glance. And I believe him. I should think he was too busy watching the threatening slant of the ship, the suspended menace discovered in the midst of the most perfect security, fascinated by the sword hanging by a hair over his imaginative head. Nothing in the world moved before his eyes, and he could depict to himself without hindrance the sudden swing upwards of the dark skyline, the sudden tilt up of the vast plain of the sea, the swift still rise, the brutal fling, the grasp of the abyss, the struggle without hope, the starlight closing over his head forever like the vault of a tomb, the revolt of his young life, the black end. He could. By Jove, who couldn't? And you must remember, he was a finished artist in that peculiar way. He was a gifted poor devil with the faculty of swift and forestalling vision. The sights it showed him had turned him into cold stone from the soles of his feet to the nape of his neck, but there was a hot dance of thoughts in his head, a dance of lame, blind, mute thoughts, a whirl of awful cripples. Didn't I tell you? He confessed himself before me as though I had the power to bind and to loose. He burrowed deep, deep in the hope of my absolution, which would have been of no good to him. This was one of those cases which no solemn deception can palliate, where no man can help, where his very Maker seems to abandon a sinner to his own devices. He stood on the starboard side of the bridge as far as he could get from the struggle for the boat, which went on with the agitation of madness and the stealthiness of a conspiracy. The two Malays had meantime remained holding to the wheel. Just picture to yourselves the actors in that, thank God, unique episode of the sea. 4 beside themselves with fierce and secret exertions, and 3 looking on in complete immobility above the awnings covering the profound ignorance of hundreds of human beings, with their weariness, with their dreams, with their hopes arrested, held by an invisible hand on the brink of annihilation. For that they were so makes no doubt to me. Given the state of the ship, this was the deadliest possible description of accident that could happen. These beggars by the boat had every reason to go distracted with funk. Frankly, had I been there, I would not have given as much as a counterfeit farthing for the ship's chance to keep above water to the end of each successive second. And still she floated. These sleeping pilgrims were destined to accomplish their whole pilgrimage to the bitterness of some other end. It was as if the Omnipotence whose mercy they confessed had needed their humble testimony on earth for a while longer, and had looked down to make a sign, "Thou shalt not," to the ocean. Their escape would trouble me as a prodigiously inexplicable event, did I not know how tough old iron can be, as tough sometimes as the spirit of some men we meet now and then, worn to a shadow and breasting the weight of life. Not the least wonder of these 20 minutes, to my mind, is the behaviour of the 2 helmsmen. They were amongst the native batch of all sorts brought over from Aden to give evidence at the inquiry. One of them, labouring under intense bashfulness, was very young, and with his smooth, yellow, cheery countenance looked even younger than he was. I remember perfectly Brierly asking him, through the interpreter, what he thought of it at the time, and the interpreter, after a short colloquy, turning to the court with an important air, "He says he thought nothing." The other, with patient blinking eyes, a blue cotton handkerchief, faded with much washing, bound with a smart twist over a lot of grey wisps, his face shrunk into grim hollows, his brown skin made darker by a mesh of wrinkles, explained that he had a knowledge of some evil thing befalling the ship, but there had been no order. He could not remember an order. Why should he leave the helm? To some further questions he jerked back his spare shoulders, and declared it never came into his mind then that the white men were about to leave the ship through fear of death. He did not believe it now. There might have been secret reasons. He wagged his old chin knowingly. Aha, secret reasons. He was a man of great experience, and he wanted that white Tuan to know, he turned towards Brierly, who didn't raise his head, that he had acquired a knowledge of many things by serving white men on the sea for a great number of years. And suddenly, with shaky excitement, he poured upon our spellbound attention a lot of queer-sounding names, names of dead and gone skippers, names of forgotten country ships, names of familiar and distorted sound, as if the hand of dumb time had been at work on them for ages. They stopped him at last. The silence fell upon the court, a silence that remained unbroken for at least a minute, and passed gently into a deep murmur. This episode was the sensation of the second day's proceedings, affecting all the audience, affecting everybody except Jim, who was sitting moodily at the end of the first bench, and never looked up at this extraordinary and damning witness that seemed possessed of some mysterious theory of defence. So these 2 Lascars stuck to the helm of that ship without steerage way, where death would have found them if such had been their destiny. The whites did not give them half a glance, had probably forgotten their existence. Assuredly Jim did not remember it. He remembered he could do nothing, now he was alone. There was nothing to do but to sink with the ship. No use making a disturbance about it, was there? He waited, upstanding, without a sound, stiffened in the idea of some sort of heroic discretion. The first engineer ran cautiously across the bridge to tug at his sleeve. "Come and help, for God's sake, come and help!" He ran back to the boat on the points of his toes, and returned directly to worry at his sleeve, begging and cursing at the same time. "I believe he would have kissed my hand," said Jim savagely, and next moment he starts foaming and whispering in my face, "If I had the time I would like to crack your skull for you." I pushed him away. Suddenly he caught hold of me round the neck. Damn him! I hit him. I hit out without looking. "Won't you save your own life, you infernal coward?" he sobs. Coward! He called me an infernal coward. Ha, 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 ha! He called me! Ha, ha, ha! He had thrown himself back and was shaking with laughter. I had never in my life heard anything so bitter as that noise. It felt like a blight on all the merriment about donkeys, pyramids, bazaars, and what not. Along the whole dim length of the gallery the voices dropped. The pale blotches of faces turned our way with one accord, and the silence became so profound that the clear tinkle of a teaspoon falling on the tessellated floor of the veranda rang out like a tiny and silvery scream. "You mustn't laugh like this with all these people about," I remonstrated. "It isn't nice for them, you know." He gave no sign of having heard at first, but after a while, with a stare that, missing me altogether, seemed to probe the heart of some awful vision, he muttered carelessly, "Ah, they'll think I'm drunk." And after that you would have thought from his appearance he would never make a sound again. But no fear. He could no more stop telling now than he could have stopped living by the mere exertion of his will. End of chapter 8.